The sun was just beginning to dip behind the hills of a small southern town, casting long shadows over the train tracks that divided the wealthy from the working class. At the edge of the dusty station, Officer Bradwell leaned casually against his patrol car, his crisp uniform spotless, and his demeanor as sharp as the shine on his polished boots. He prided himself on being in control, the kind of man who could demand respect, or fear, with a single glance. Today, though, he was looking for some amusement. Bradwell's eyes scanned the platform until they landed on a man stepping off the train. Dressed in a simple dark suit, the stranger carried himself with quiet confidence, his broad shoulders relaxed but commanding. He was black, mid-30s, and his shoes, though polished, had clearly walked through their fair share of long days. The man carried a leather satchel in one hand and a small suitcase in the other. His face was calm, unreadable even, as if he had already seen more of the world than the townspeople ever could. Bradwell smirked, his mind already crafting a scenario to entertain himself, and if the opportunity arose, remind this outsider of his place. He didn't recognize the man, but around here, introductions were less about who you were and more about where you fit. In Bradwell's world, power meant everything, and he intended to make sure this stranger understood who had it. As the man passed, Bradwell stepped forward, blocking his path. Well, he drawled, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. You look like a man who could use some work. The stranger paused, glancing up at Bradwell with an expression that neither challenged nor yielded. Good evening, officer, he said, his tone even but respectful. Bradwell leaned closer, invading the man's space with a smirk that turned heads on the platform. Put some bags of coal over there need hauling, he said, pointing toward a pile by the station. How about you help me out? Wouldn't want you to think folks around here aren't welcoming. The stranger raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unshaken. Coal, he asked, as if considering the suggestion. That's right. Bradwell's grin widened. Unless, of course, you're too good for honest work. A few townsfolk nearby pretended not to listen, though their curious glances betrayed their interest. Most knew better than to interfere with Bradwell when he was in one of his moods. The man stood there for a moment, his expression unreadable, before he slowly set his suitcase and satchel down on the platform. Honest work, he repeated softly, as if testing the phrase. Then, with a faint smile, he added, lead the way. Bradwell barked out a laugh, clapping the man on the back in a way that wasn't entirely friendly. That's the spirit, he said, motioning toward the coal. The stranger followed, his movements calm and deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. Bradwell watched him with satisfaction, already imagining how this story would play out at the bar later. But what Bradwell didn't know, what none of the onlookers knew, was that the man he had just humiliated wasn't just passing through town. He was their new governor, and the joke was about to be on Bradwell. Bradwell sauntered ahead, glancing back every so often to make sure the stranger was still following. He was enjoying the way the man stayed quiet, carrying himself with a kind of dignity that made Bradwell want to knock him down a peg. The sun was lower now, bathing the scene in a reddish hue that made the coal pile stand out even more against the dusty background. The platform had mostly cleared out, but a few stragglers lingered, pretending to mind their own business, while their eyes trailed the odd pair. The station master, an older man with a permanent frown etched into his face, leaned against the doorframe, watching from the shadows. He had seen Bradwell pull this kind of stunt before, but tonight something felt different. As the stranger reached the pile of coal, Bradwell crossed his arms and tilted his head. There you go. Let's see how long it takes you to get that loaded into the storage shed, he said, pointing to a ramshackle structure on the far side of the station. The man looked at the pile for a moment before glancing back at Bradwell. His eyes lingered on the officer's smug expression, but he said nothing. Instead, he removed his jacket, folding it carefully and setting it on top of his suitcase. Then, rolling up his sleeves with a deliberate calm, he turned back to the coal. Bradwell leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching with satisfaction as the man got to work. The officer didn't notice the way the stranger's hands moved, not like a laborer's, rough and practiced, but with a kind of precision that suggested he'd done harder things than this in his life. He didn't complain or falter, and though the weight of the coal was evident in his movements, he carried each load with the same steady rhythm. The onlookers whispered among themselves, their voices low but filled with curiosity. Who was this man? Why hadn't he argued or refused? Something about his composure unsettled them, even if they couldn't put their finger on why. After a while, the station master shuffled closer to Bradwell, his face tight with disapproval. "Don't you think you've had your fun?" he muttered under his breath. Bradwell waved him off. "Relax, old man. It's just a bit of work. Builds character." "Doesn't seem like he's the one who needs it," the station master muttered, more to himself than to Bradwell. Meanwhile, the stranger continued his task, each trip to the shed as measured and deliberate as the last. The air grew cooler as the evening wore on, and the station lights flickered to life, casting a yellow glow over the scene. Still, the man worked without a word, his steady breathing the only sound breaking the silence. Bradwell, growing bored, began checking his watch. He had expected the man to quit by now, to show some sign of struggle or even beg for a break. But the stranger's determination only made Bradwell more irritated. He didn't like how the man's calmness seemed to mock him, as if this task, his petty attempt at humiliation, was beneath notice. Finally, as the last of the coal was moved, the stranger wiped his hands on a handkerchief he'd pulled from his pocket. His shirt was damp with sweat, but his posture remained straight, his expression unchanged. He turned to Bradwell, his voice steady but polite. "Anything else, officer?" Bradwell felt a flicker of annoyance, but he covered it with a laugh. "Well, looks like you're tougher than you look. Maybe next time I'll find something harder for you to do." The man gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I'll look forward to it." He reached for his jacket, brushing off the faint dust that had settled on it, and slipped it on with the same quiet confidence he'd arrived with. Picking up his suitcase and satchel, he tipped his head in a polite nod. "Good evening." And with that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing on the platform as he disappeared into the darkening streets. Bradwell stayed rooted in place, his smirk fading as he watched the stranger leave. Something about the man's demeanor nodded him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He shook off the feeling, convincing himself it didn't matter. He put the stranger in his place. That was all that counted. The next morning, however, the town buzzed with an energy Bradwell hadn't seen in years. People gathered in small groups, their conversations animated and their faces lit with excitement. It didn't take long for Bradwell to hear the news. The governor had arrived early, ahead of his official welcome ceremony scheduled for the weekend. Bradwell frowned, annoyed at the commotion. He wasn't particularly interested in politics, and he certainly didn't care about the governor. To him, it was just another man in a suit who would show up, make speeches, and disappear without ever understanding what life was like in a place like this. Still, curiosity got the better of him. Later that afternoon, he found himself standing among the crowd gathered outside the courthouse, where the mayor was introducing the governor to the townsfolk. The mayor's voice boomed through the microphone, his words enthusiastic but rehearsed. "And now, it is my great honor to present to you our new governor, a man of vision, integrity, and dedication. Please give a warm welcome to Governor Elijah Carter." Bradwell's jaw tightened as the crowd erupted in applause. He craned his neck to get a better view, and when the governor stepped onto the makeshift stage, Bradwell's heart skipped a beat. It was him. The stranger from the train stood there, his suit immaculate, his posture regal. He greeted the crowd with a warm smile, his eyes scanning the sea of faces with an ease that spoke of both confidence and compassion. Bradwell felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. His mind raced as he replayed the events of the previous evening. The coal, the smirks, the humiliation he tried to inflict. Governor Carter's voice cut through Bradwell's spiraling thoughts, smooth and steady as he addressed the crowd. "Thank you for such a warm welcome. It's an honor to be here in this beautiful town, among people who represent the heart and soul of our great state." The crowd cheered again, and Bradwell's stomach churned. He glanced around, half expecting someone to point at him, to call him out for what he'd done. But no one seemed to notice his growing discomfort. Governor Carter continued, his words measured and thoughtful. I believe in hard work and fairness, and in holding ourselves to the highest standards of respect and decency. These values are what guide me, and I hope they resonate with each of you. Bradwell swallowed hard, his mouth dry. There was no doubt in his mind that the governor's words were meant for him, even if no one else realized it. As the governor finished his speech and stepped down from the stage, Bradwell felt the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. He had no idea what the governor might do, or if he even intended to acknowledge what had happened. But one thing was certain. Bradwell's comfortable sense of control was gone, replaced by growing unease that refused to let him go. The crowd began to disperse, and Bradwell stood frozen, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The courthouse steps emptied quickly as the crowd broke apart. People eager to return to their routines, but the excitement lingered in the air. Governor Elijah Carter's name was on everyone's lips, the new leader already casting a powerful impression on the small town. Some spoke of his eloquence, others admired his poise, and a few whispered with wonder about how young he seemed to hold such authority. But Bradwell stood still, his feet planted on the sidewalk, his mind swirling with doubt and dread. He kept replaying every detail of the previous night in his head. The way he'd tried to demean the man, the smug satisfaction he'd felt watching him move coal like a laborer. Now that same man was the most powerful figure in the state, and worse, he hadn't said a word about it. The silence gnawed at Bradwell's nerves. What was Carter planning? Bradwell shook himself, forcing his legs to move as he walked back to the station. His shift wasn't over, and he needed something to distract him. Though deep down, he knew no amount of routine could shake the uneasy feeling taking root in his chest. He told himself it didn't matter. Carter might be the governor, but what could he really do? A man like that had bigger problems to deal with than one small-town officer. But as the day wore on, Bradwell couldn't stop glancing over his shoulder, feeling watched even when he was alone. Every passing car, every stranger's glance seemed charged with hidden meaning. His fellow officers noticed his unease. "You good, Brad?" One of them asked over lunch, his tone casual but curious. "You're jumpier than a cat in a thunderstorm." "Fine," Bradwell snapped, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "Just tired, that's all." The officer raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. Bradwell was known for being brash and unshakable, and seeing him rattled was almost unsettling itself. That evening, as Bradwell returned home, he found a small envelope waiting for him on his doorstep. His name was written on the front in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. His heart skipped as he picked it up, the weight of it feeling heavier than it should. He glanced around the street, but it was empty, the setting sun casting long shadows over the quiet neighborhood. Inside the envelope was a single piece of paper. The message was brief, but sent a chill down Bradwell's spine. Asterisk, respect isn't given. It's earned. Perhaps you should think about what kind of legacy you're building. Asterisk. There was no signature, but Bradwell didn't need one. He knew exactly who had sent it. His hands trembled as he folded the paper back into the envelope. Was this a warning? A threat? Or something else entirely? The ambiguity only deepened his anxiety, the lack of clear action more unnerving than outright confrontation. Governor Carter was playing a game Bradwell didn't understand, and he didn't like feeling like a pawn. The next few days passed in a haze. Bradwell kept his head down, avoiding the places where he might cross paths with the governor. But no matter how much he tried to steer clear, Carter's presence loomed everywhere. His face appeared in the local paper, his name buzzed in conversations of the diner and the barber shop. People spoke of him with admiration, marveling at his approachability and vision. Then came the invitations. Governor Carter announced a town hall meeting, an open forum for the community to voice their concerns and share their ideas. It was a rare gesture, one that won him even more favor among the townsfolk. Bradwell's stomach sank when he saw the flyer tacked to the bulletin board at the station. He couldn't avoid it forever. Sooner or later, he'd have to face the man he had wronged. The night of the town hall arrived quickly. The courthouse was packed, the energy in the room electric. People filled every seat, and those who couldn't find a place to sit lined the walls. Bradwell stood in the back, his hat pulled low, hoping to blend into the crowd. Governor Carter entered the room to thunderous applause. He moved through the crowd with an ease that felt natural, shaking hands and greeting people like old friends. When he reached the podium, the room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice steady and warm. "This town represents everything I love about our state: resilience, community, and the determination to build a better future. That's why I wanted to start here, to listen to your stories and understand your challenges." Bradwell shifted uncomfortably, the governor's words cutting through the room like a blade. He kept his eyes on the floor, afraid that Carter might spot him. The meeting went on, with residents sharing their concerns about schools, infrastructure, and employment opportunities. Carter listened intently, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. His sincerity was evident, and even the most skeptical voices softened in his presence. But as the evening drew to a close, Carter's tone changed. He stepped away from the podium, his hands clasped in front of him as he addressed the room more directly. "There's one more thing I'd like to talk about before we wrap up," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs in the crowd. "It's about respect. Not just for each other, but for ourselves. Respect shapes the way we treat people, the way we lead, and the way we're remembered." Bradwell felt a lump form in his throat. Carter wasn't looking at him. His gaze swept across the room, inclusive but piercing. "It's easy to assume we know someone's worth based on their appearance, their background, or their circumstances," Carter continued. "But true leadership and true humanity comes from seeing beyond those assumptions." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Bradwell's chest tightened as he realized Carter wasn't just speaking to the room, he was speaking to him. As the meeting ended and people began to file out, Bradwell lingered near the back, torn between slipping out unnoticed and confronting the weight pressing down on him. Just as he was about to turn and leave, a voice stopped him in his tracks. "Officer Bradwell." Bradwell froze. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting Carter's steady gaze. The governor stood a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "I was hoping we'd get a chance to talk," Carter said, his tone polite but firm. Bradwell swallowed hard, his palms damp as he nodded. "Governor," he managed, his voice quieter than he intended. Carter didn't say anything right away. He studied Bradwell for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "Walk with me," he said finally, motioning toward the courthouse steps. Bradwell hesitated, but the weight of Carter's presence left him no choice. With a stiff nod, he followed the governor out into the cool night air, his heart pounding as they disappeared into the shadows. Bradwell followed Governor Carter out of the courthouse, his footsteps heavy on the worn stone steps. The night air was crisp, and the faint murmur of departing townsfolk lingered in the background. The two men walked in silence for a moment, their figures illuminated by the glow of the street lamps. Bradwell's mind raced, his thoughts tumbling over one another as he tried to anticipate what was coming. Carter stopped near the edge of the town square, where a quiet bench sat beneath a cluster of oak trees. He turned to Bradwell, his hands resting lightly in his coat pockets. The governor's expression remained calm, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that made Bradwell's chest tighten. "Do you know why I didn't say anything that night at the train station?" Carter asked, his voice steady, but cutting through the stillness like a blade. Bradwell swallowed hard, his gaze darting to the ground. He had no answer, no excuse that would justify what he had done. His silence hung in the air, and for the first time in years he felt small. "I stayed quiet because I wanted to see how you'd react." Carter continued, his tone even. "I wanted to know if you'd reflect on your actions, or if you brushed them off like they didn't matter." Bradwell's head snapped up, his face flushing with a mixture of shame and indignation. "I didn't mean any harm," he said, his voice defensive but faltering. "It was just a bit of—" "A joke," Carter interrupted, his eyebrows raising slightly. "Is that what you were going to say? That humiliating a stranger in front of an audience is just a joke?" The words hit Bradwell like a blow, and for a moment he couldn't speak. He had never been on the receiving end of such quiet authority, and it unnerved him more than any outburst could. I didn't know who you were," Bradwell finally muttered, his voice weak. Carter let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "Would it have made a difference if you did? Or would you have treated me with the same lack of respect, assuming I was someone beneath your notice?" The question cut deeper than Bradwell wanted to admit. He looked away, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Carter sighed, his voice softening slightly. "I don't expect perfection, Officer Bradwell. None of us are perfect. But what I do expect is accountability. Leadership, whether it's as a governor, an officer, or just a human being, requires us to hold ourselves to a higher standard." The words stung not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Bradwell shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like never before. "I didn't come here tonight to embarrass you," Carter said, his tone measured. "I came to remind you, and everyone in this town, that respect isn't about titles or uniforms. It's about how we treat one another when we think no one is watching." Bradwell's jaw tightened as he struggled to find his voice. The quiet power in Carter's words left no room for deflection or denial. For the first time in years, Bradwell felt truly exposed, the armor of his badge and bravado stripped away. I don't know what you want me to do," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Carter regarded him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "What I want, Officer Bradwell, is for you to ask yourself why you did what you did. What made you think it was acceptable to treat someone that way? And once you've answered that, I want you to make it right, not just with me, but with yourself and this community." The words lingered in the air, heavy with expectation. Bradwell felt his chest tighten as the full weight of Carter's challenge sank in. This wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about transformation. The governor straightened, his posture radiating quiet strength. "Good night, officer," he said, his tone carrying a finality that left no room for further argument. Bradwell watched as Carter walked away, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the square. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the cool night breeze. Bradwell stood there for what felt like hours, the governor's words replaying in his mind. He thought about the choices he had made, the man he had become, and the weight of the expectations now placed on his shoulders. As the town square emptied completely, Bradwell turned and began the slow walk home. Each step felt heavier than the last, the path ahead uncertain but impossible to ignore. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of a train whistle echoed, a reminder of the night that had set everything in motion. The air was thick with tension, the unresolved conflict hanging over him like a storm cloud. Bradwell knew this was only the beginning, and the road to redemption, if it even existed, would be long and unforgiving. But for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something he couldn't quite name, a glimmer of hope or the fear of facing his own reflection. The night seemed darker than usual as he disappeared into the shadows, the weight of his choices bearing down on him, with no clear end in sight. The walk back to his house was a blur for Bradwell, the governor's words echoing in his mind with each step. The night seemed darker, quieter, almost as if the town itself was holding its breath. By the time he reached his driveway, his chest felt tight, his heart pounding in his ears. As he fumbled with his keys, his hand trembled, but before he could unlock the door, he noticed something unusual, a faint glow from his living room window. Bradwell froze. He knew he hadn't left any lights on. His hand instinctively went to his belt, but he wasn't wearing his uniform, and his gun was inside. Carefully, he stepped to the side of the door, peering through the window. The sight sent a chill down his spine. A single lantern sat on his coffee table, its soft light casting eerie shadows around the room. Next to it was an envelope identical to the one he'd found days ago. The rest of the house appeared undisturbed, but the presence of the lantern and envelope made his blood run cold. Someone had been inside. For a moment, Bradwell considered calling for backup, but he hesitated. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was personal, meant for him alone. Taking a deep breath, he unlocked the door and stepped inside, his every nerve on edge. The house was silent, the air heavy with tension. Bradwell's eyes locked on the envelope as he approached it cautiously. The lantern's flame flickered as he picked up the envelope, the faint scent of kerosene filling the room. His hands shook as he opened it, pulling out the folded piece of paper inside. The message was short but chilling. Asterisk, asterisk, sometimes the past catches up faster than we expect. Are you ready to face it? Asterisk, asterisk. Bradwell's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just about the governor. Someone else was involved, someone who knew more than they should. He scanned the room again, half expecting to find a hidden figure watching him, but the house remained still. The words on the note annoyed him. Asterisk, the past catches up, asterisk. He couldn't help but think back to all the moments he had tried to bury, all the times he had chosen authority over empathy, power over fairness. The choices he had made, the people he had wronged, it was all coming back now, one way or another. As Bradwell stood there, his phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. He pulled it out quickly, his pulse spiking when he saw an unknown number on the screen. Against his better judgment, he answered. Officer Bradwell, the voice on the other end said, smooth but laced with a hint of menace. I trust you received my message. Bradwell's grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? He demanded, his voice low but firm. That's not important, the voice replied. What matters is that you understand what's at stake. The choices you've made, the people you've crossed. They remember, even if you'd like to forget. Bradwell's stomach churned. He felt like the ground beneath him was shifting, and he couldn't find his footing. What do you want? He asked, his voice shaking despite his effort to sound composed. There was a pause on the other end, the silence stretching unbearably. Then the voice spoke again, its tone calm but pointed. I want you to think about the man you've become, officer, and I want you to ask yourself if you're ready to face the consequences. Before Bradwell could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, his mind racing. This wasn't just about Governor Carter anymore. Someone else was pulling the strings, someone who knew enough to rattle him to his core. The next morning, Bradwell arrived at the station early, his nerves frayed from a sleepless night. The weight of the note and the phone call clung to him like a shadow, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. As he sat at his desk, sorting through paperwork, a knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see a young man standing in the doorway, his expression hesitant but determined. Can I help you? Bradwell asked, his tone sharper than he intended. The young man stepped inside, clutching a folder tightly in his hands. I think you should see this, he said, placing the folder on the desk. Bradwell frowned, opening the folder to reveal a stack of photographs and documents. His blood ran cold as he flipped through them. Each photo showed him in moments he thought no one had witnessed. Interactions on the job where his judgment had faltered, instances where his authority had been abused. These were sent anonymously, the young man explained, his voice uneasy. I don't know who's behind it, but they wanted to make sure you saw them. Bradwell's hands clenched the edges of the folder as he stared at the evidence before him. The photos weren't just damning. They were a stark reflection of everything he had tried to ignore about himself. Why are you showing me this? Bradwell asked, his voice low. Because whoever sent these doesn't just want you to see them, the young man said. They want everyone to see them. The words hit Bradwell like a freight train. His world, carefully constructed and tightly controlled, was unraveling. Someone out there knew everything, and they were determined to expose him. As the young man left, Bradwell sat in his chair, the weight of the folder pressing down on him. The past wasn't just catching up. It was closing in, faster than he could have ever anticipated. Outside, the town buzzed with its usual life, oblivious to the storm brewing behind the scenes. But Bradwell knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light, and he had no idea how to stop it, or if he even deserved to. The governor's challenge and mysterious messages felt like a reckoning, one he couldn't escape. And somewhere in the distance, unseen but ever present, the shadow of his choices loomed larger than ever, ready to bring everything crashing down. The air in the town felt heavier as Bradwell sat alone in his office, staring at the photographs scattered across his desk. His pulse throbbed in his temples, and the walls seemed to close in on him. He had spent years wearing a badge, believing it gave him power, authority, and immunity from the consequences of his actions. Now, all of it, the jokes, the orders barked without care, the people he belittled, was coming back to haunt him. The realization left him hollow, as if the very foundation of his life was crumbling beneath him. A sharp knock on his office door startled him. He glanced up, his heart racing. For a fleeting moment, he hoped it was a colleague with mundane news, something to pull him out of the spiral. But when the door opened, Governor Carter stepped inside, his expression unreadable, a folder tucked under his arm. Bradwell stood, his body tense, unsure of what to expect. "Governor," he said, his voice strained, "I didn't expect to see you here." Carter closed the door behind him, his movements deliberate. "I thought it was time we had another conversation," he said, placing the folder on the desk. His tone was calm, but carried an unmistakable edge. Bradwell's eyes flicked to the folder. "If this is about the photographs—" "It's not just about the photographs," Carter interrupted, his gaze steady. "It's about accountability. It's about understanding the weight of the choices we make and the impact they have on others." Bradwell sank back into his chair, his hands gripping the armrests. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I see that now. But I don't know how to fix this." Carter leaned forward slightly, his expression softening. "You start by taking responsibility," he said. "Not just in words, but in actions. The people you've hurt deserve more than apologies. They deserve change." Before Bradwell could respond, Carter opened the folder, revealing a document with the state seal. He slid it across the desk. Bradwell hesitated, then picked it up, his eyes scanning the contents. His stomach churned as he realized what it was. "You're filing formal charges against me?" he asked, his voice shaking. Carter nodded. "It's not personal, Bradwell. It's about doing what's right. This isn't just about your actions that night at the train station. It's about a pattern of behavior that has gone unchecked for too long." Bradwell's mind raced. He thought about protesting, about pleading for leniency, but the look in Carter's eyes stopped him. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about justice. "I can't stop what's already in motion," Carter continued, "but I can offer you a choice. You can fight this, deny everything, and let it play out in the court of public opinion. Or you can own up to your actions and start making amends." The weight of the moment pressed down on Bradwell, leaving him breathless. The man he had been, the one who had laughed at the expense of others who had taken his power for granted, would have fought tooth and nail to protect himself. But sitting across from Carter, he realized that version of himself had no future. "I don't know if I can fix everything I've done," Bradwell said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I'm willing to try." Carter studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "That's a start." The two men sat in silence, the tension in the room slowly easing. But just as Bradwell felt a flicker of hope, Carter spoke again, his tone cautious. "There's one more thing you should know," Carter said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Bradwell, who unfolded it with trembling hands. The note was handwritten, the same sharp penmanship as the messages he had received before. But this one was different. Asterisk, asterisk, the truth isn't just about what you've done. It's about what you've hidden. Are you ready for what comes next? Asterisk, asterisk. Bradwell's heart sank. He looked up at Carter, his face pale. "I thought you were the one sending these." Carter shook his head. "No, but whoever it is, they're not done yet." The realization hit Bradwell like a punch to the gut. The photographs, the notes, the phone calls, it was all part of a larger game, one he didn't fully understand. And whoever was behind it wasn't just interested in exposing his past. They were after something deeper, something he had yet to confront. As the governor left the office, leaving Bradwell alone with his thoughts, a chill ran down his spine. The storm wasn't over. In fact, it felt like it was only just beginning. The truth he thought he had faced was only a fraction of what lay ahead. And as he sat there, the weight of the final note in his hands, he realized the past had more secrets to reveal, ones he might not be ready to face.